is Demetrius Spinrad.
And this is Isaac Meyer.
And you're listening to the Criminal Records Podcast, a podcast about some of the weirdest cases in true crime history.
And you've been talking this one up quite a bit, so I am very excited.
Yes, we have a case today of a group of women who gaslit, gatekeeped, and girl-bossed their way through London. And I do mean gaslight literally. This did begin in the age of gaslight. And although it continued for nearly 100 years.
That's a pretty, long-running criminal activity right there. I mean, I'm trying to think of, honestly, legitimate businesses that have lasted that long, and it's a little difficult. So what sort of criminal enterprise are we talking about here? There's a long-running protection racket, some bootlegging. What keeps you going that long?
Well, this is a group known as, among themselves, they're known as the 40 Thieves. Among sort of people who've studied them, they're mostly known as the 40 Elephants because of their association with another gang. But they had up their fingers in a lot of crimes during their nearly 100-year run. But their primary focus was shoplifting. Okay, and I know this is going to sound strange because shoplifting does not sound like a very serious crime that can sustain a criminal organization.
Pettiest of petty crimes right there.
Okay, here's the thing. The tricky part of shoplifting is not just stealing the goods. It's having a reliable way to turn a profit by selling the goods, usually for less than their original list price.
Right. With you so far, I played Skyrim.
So it's possible to shift some kinds of shoplifted items yourself if you do the, classic it fell off the back of the truck maneuver. If you can find enough consumers who are attracted to a low price and don't want to ask questions. But that means you're either taking the risk of running a shop yourself, which officers of the law tend to notice, or you have to move around enough or work in a marginal enough space that it's hard to build up a good customer base. In modern times, shoplifters and other small-time thieves have the internet that they can sell items on. Marketplaces like Craigslist, eBay, Facebook Marketplace, they don't really have a reliable way of checking the provenance of goods. But in the old days, if you wanted to turn a profit on shoplifting, you would do better if you had connections to a fence. Again, with your Skyrim knowledge, that is someone who buys stolen goods and then sells them to other customers.
Right, you find them under in the sewers under the town after you do the thing where you sneak into. This is a very niche joke that I'm sure only a few people appreciate.
I probably says good things about you that your knowledge of the criminal underworld comes from Skyrim and not lived experience, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, graduate students, we don't make very good criminals. We tend to overthink things.
So if you are not a high elf, if you need to find a fence, it helps to have an in with organized crime. And for the subjects of today's episode, that came through a gang called the Elephant and Castle Gang.
That is possibly the most, British name for a gang I've ever heard. Now I'm just picturing people stealing things with their pinkies out.
Okay, so this is not a very high-class gang, but they did have a long history and deep roots in the city of London, which gave them a significant amount of control over their territory to the south of the Thames River. The gang actually started all the way back in the 1780s when a group of highway robbers started hanging out at a coaching inn called the Elephant and Castle Tavern. It's a sort of signpost on the inn was literally an elephant with a castle on its back. This was a prime time for highway robbery because stagecoaches were becoming faster and many people trusted valuable mail and goods to them, and trains were still quite a few decades away at the time. The area around this coaching inn is actually to this day still called the Elephant and Castle neighborhood. It's pretty chic, actually. It's a pretty upscale place now.
Isn't that all of London?
Yeah.
Are there any poor people left in London? I'm sure they're there somewhere, but
quite a lot of London is very expensive now. But this area has had a lot of ups and downs over the centuries. At the time, it was a poor working class neighborhood. The Elephant and Castle gang, also just known as the Elephant Gang, didn't just stick with stick-ups. They became the distributors of stolen goods for other highwaymen. So they were taking part in this underworld of not just committing the crimes, but committing further crimes by passing along stolen goods.
Side note, it really says a lot about the criminal justice system during this time that not a gang can be in a specific place so often, they literally take the name of the business. And yet, the police system is not such that they know, we should probably go shut that down.
Yeah, the Elephant and Castle gang survived through probably one of the biggest changes in modern policing. So they outlasted an entire legal system, basically.
I mean, good for them. It sounds like a well-run business.
So organized crime doesn't just happen in a completely isolated bubble. While the men in the Elephant Gang worked the neighborhood, their wives, sisters, girlfriends, mothers, and daughters were also interested in getting in on this action. They brawled, they shoplifted, they stole clothing, and they carved out their own space in society. They started calling themselves the 40 Thieves, probably named after the story of Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves. And side note, this is a really popular choice for a gang name at the time. There are actually quite a few different gangs called the 40 Thieves. New York's oldest known street gang actually shared that name. As far as I can tell, the two organizations weren't affiliated, although there was quite a bit of back and forth travel from New York to London, and quite a few New York gangsters did get involved with the 40 Thieves and with other London street gangs at various
You know,
points.
gangs these days, they think of names and none of them are references to classic literary works. And it's really very disappointing.
Kids these days don't know how to name a gang.
I want more highbrow references in my gang names.
So, around 1890, this group of women elects their first leader, who they call a queen. And this is possibly inspired by the fact that they had grown up in a country ruled by Queen Victoria. So, the first queen of the 40 Thieves is named Mary Carr. She often went by the name Polly, and newspapers reported on the notorious Polly the Pickpocket, Handsome Polly, the Queen Thief. She was also known as Molly Main. Her day job was actually modeling for artists. She went by the name Annie Leslie in her day job, and she was hailed as the Swan Necked Beauty.
That's some Zoolander shit right there.
So Mary had actually had a really rough early life. Her mother had died when she was only 9, and her father, John Carr, was a thief and a forger with ties to criminal organizations on both sides of the Atlantic. She began her own life of crime in her teens and spent some of her youth at the St. Mary the Virgin Female Penitentiary in Kent. Even long after she was out of her teens, Mary would trap her marks by playing a well-dressed lost teenage girl. She would ask men on the street to escort her to her lodgings. She would then get pretty familiar with the men, and then she would start crying for help and demand that these men pay up to avoid a scandal. And this is an adaptation of a very classic con called the Badger Game. Her targets included at least one notable legislator who had to pay her £400 to keep his name from being released. So she made a lot of money on this.
How enterprising.
Unfortunately, Mary wasn't always just selling her own body or pretending to sell her own body. In 1896, she scandalized London by being arrested and tried for kidnapping a young boy. And the implication, kind of reading between the lines, is that the boy was going to be involved in non-consensual sex work. It's probable that what actually happened is that a different criminal bought the boy from his mother, and he was then placed under Mary's care. Mary's trial and sentencing were reported on widely by the press, and she was the subject of the play, which has an amazing name, The Worst Woman in London, Her Second Time on Earth, The Female Swindler, But a Disgrace to Her Sex. That is all one play.
I really like the kind of the last clause of that. Just like you got to make sure that people know you're not supposed to be like root for this person, right? Because the rest of that sounds just fun.
Yeah, it is. There is actually a really long tradition of plays about female criminals where it's a little unclear if maybe you're supposed to be rooting for the criminal a little bit, but whoever was writing this play was wanted to be really clear about where he stood on this one.
Yeah, I mean, apparently he's so adamant that he can't even pick one title. He has to have 4 different ones and just use all of them.
So Mary served several years of penal servitude for the kidnapping case, which was her most prominent trial. But she returned to a life of crime immediately after her release and was arrested again in 1900 for stealing jewels and a gun from West End hotel rooms. She served 2 years for that crime. She was released in 1902, and she continued to commit more crimes throughout the decade. We know that she died in 1924. So her successor, the next queen of the 40 Thieves, was Minnie Duggan, who rose through the gang's ranks. Minnie was a brawler who was so vicious during her attacks that she once accidentally slashed up her own associate in a frenzy while she was attacking another woman who'd been seeing her ex-boyfriend. A lot of the brawls that the 40 Thieves got in over their near century of operation were about men. Sometimes it was actual interpersonal spats, but sometimes it was things like they really didn't like people marrying outsiders. Because they were a very well organized criminal organization. They were okay with women dating other people in, for instance, the Elephants gang, but they really didn't want women dating people who might snitch.
Man, that's some real Romeo and Juliet shit right there.
Yeah, there were a lot of criminal gangs in London, and there were a lot of interpersonal tensions in those gangs, and then those gangs would fight each other a lot. As the Queen of Thieves title became well known, it was sought after, but being the queen also put a target on your back since the police just loved announcing that they had arrested the current queen. So a variety of women ended up claiming the title over the years.
And like, I mean, I get obviously there's prestige in being able to call yourself the queen of a street gang. That's pretty cool. But like, beyond just the status, like what makes the position worthwhile enough that it's kind of worth fighting over and trying to claim in this way?
Well, the queen got celebrity status in the papers, but she also had a high status among the less high ranking thieves. She could command obedience from other gang members, and that obedience could mean following very strict codes of conduct. Most importantly, she got a larger share of the takings from operations. And for the shoplifting portion of the 40 Thieves operation, the takings could be very good. Now, here is a crucial part of this story. During the time that the 40 Thieves or the 40 Elephants were operating, the way people shopped went through some major changes. In the early and mid 1800s, shops were small by modern standards and largely owned by individuals. But then there's this new trend that causes an entire revolution in the way people shop, especially the way that people are shopping in central London. And that is the department store. Stores with a variety of fashions for women had been operating in London since the 1700s. But Harrods, which had once been a small luxury goods store and actually an exotic pet store, ballooned into this giant complex of retail in the late 1800s. Selfridges, another department store, opened in 1909 and immediately tries to outcompete Harrods, and quite a few other department stores spring up around London around this time.
So when I hear the phrase department store, my image is definitely very colored by being an American. I'm picturing like a Macy's in a local mall that's like sprawling and easy to get lost in, just not a very nice place to hang out. But I'm guessing that's not quite right, particularly because I've heard the name Harrods before, usually in conjunction with like very high end auctions and like the kind of social events that like they won't let you in if you've ever taken out a loan that didn't have at least 8 zeros at the end of it, like that level of wealth. So I'm guessing I'm a little off.
You have a really interesting understanding of English class.
I mean, I'm American. Class is just money. We don't have all this aristocratic nonsense.
So, speaking of American classlessness, most department stores in America, even the ones that were formerly very high end, are really a shadow of what the department store used to be. In their glory days, department stores were kind of like an entire really upscale mall by themselves. They would have lots of restaurants in them. They would have hordes of helpful salespeople in every department. They were just a completely different way to shop. Because in the past, shopkeepers had stored their most valuable items behind their counters, and they would only take them out when people asked. That meant that thieves who wanted to shoplift would have to engage in actually kind of a con. They would have to get the shopkeeper to take the items out, and then they would either just have to grab the goods and run, or they would have to use clever sleight of hand to pocket small bits of jewelry or small items while someone else distracted the shopkeeper for them. And As late as the mid 1800s, women were at risk for hanging for the theft of even small items. Women could be hanged for something like stealing a pair of gloves. So the risk of shoplifting was really, really high, and the chance at a reward was quite low. But department stores did not have shopkeepers hiding all the best stuff behind the counters. They put everything on display. And this is where browsing was invented. Shoppers were encouraged to browse and to pick up whatever items they wanted, which was not a habit that had been encouraged in retail before. And this makes department stores massively tempting to thieves. They were especially excellent hunting grounds for women who could blend in as well-to-do browsers and pocket small items. And women were great shoplifters because they had these big puffy skirts, and they could sew special openings into their skirts, and that would allow them to hide items in the lining. And at the time, having a lot of puffy crinoline under your skirt would be very fashionable. It's very hard to notice one suspicious looking bulge among the puffiness of crinoline. So they could do that, or they could wear shawls and cloaks with convenient pockets. Best of all, not only had the law become more lenient, but stores had become more lax. Department stores were so huge that they were actually prepared to eat the losses of theft in the form of stock write-downs. And this meant that the stores decided that the increased profits from all these browsers who enjoyed not being treated with suspicion was worth the shrinkage from thieves. So the 40 thieves excel at shoplifting in these rich new hunting grounds. We know the value of only some of their thefts through the criminal records of the women who were caught. A lot of them were stealing items like fur muffs, watches, and jewelry. In addition to watching out for the law, the women of the 40 Thieves had to watch out for men in the criminal underworld. In 1913, 2 women associated with the 40 Thieves were assaulted with a broken bottle and cleaning fluid by an international thief who wanted to take the diamond rings they'd stolen for himself. So this is the weirdness of the world that these women were operating in. A lot of them were not just supporting themselves and their families. It was actually really common for them to get involved with a sort of questionable boyfriend who ended up taking a lot of their earnings away from them.
Yeah, not the most stable line of employment, one imagines.
Not at all. But in the early 1900s, some members of the 40 Elephants found a new group of criminal women to associate with, the suffragettes.
Ooh, now that's a rough group of characters.
Absolutely. We remember the suffragettes as fairly nonviolent today because I think we generally, when people portray heroic or righteous people, they're shown to be nonviolent. But actually, a lot of the suffragettes were involved in some very violent protests. Some women associated with the 40 Elephants did seem to be sincerely protesting with the suffragettes. However, others realized that the chaotic riots that some of the suffragettes were involved in were a great chance to loot shops.
That's very enterprising. Well, I mean, that's a lot of great ways to steal from people. And I actually hadn't really considered that department stores would be such tempting targets, but it makes a lot of sense. But that leads us now to the question: how are these gang members, these young women, turning their loot into profits?
Well, as I said, if you're a shoplifter, it's a really good idea to have a network of fences. Some fences will sell items directly, but a lot of them have clever methods of concealing and cleaning stolen goods so they can pass them along into the market. Receivers of stolen jewelry will often clean goods by prying precious gems out of their settings, because it's very hard to identify a stolen gemstone. I mean, unless a gemstone is really unusually large, it's not usually that distinctive.
Right. One gemstone is another gemstone, just different colors, different cuts. Right.
Yeah, so you might, for instance, be able to identify a stolen necklace. It's very hard to conclusively prove that a bunch of loose jewels came out of a stolen necklace because the really distinctive thing, which is the setting, is gone. Thieves and fences have always had a really complicated relationship. On one hand, thieves get much less than the full value of their stolen goods from fences. So on one hand, even if a thief is stealing hundreds and hundreds of pounds worth of goods, which quite a few of these thieves were, they're not actually receiving the full value. So it is a little bit of a ripoff for the thief. But at the same time, fences are actually at much higher risk than the thieves because they are operating a business in a fixed location that police can survey and raid. And because of this, there's also the risk to the thieves that the fences will inform on them in order to get out of trouble. So it can be a very complicated relationship. There's both a lot of trust that has to go into that relationship, and it's often a relationship that happens with the understanding that these people might turn on each other.
Yeah, that seems like it would not encourage the most healthy of workplace relationships.
Yeah, so because of this, the complication of this relationship, and the fact that both thieves and fences spent a lot of time bouncing in and out of prison, so you don't want just one fence to rely on because you don't know if that fence is going to be available tomorrow. So the 40 elephants end up with a variety of fences at their disposal through their connections in the criminal world. Some of their fences specialized in high-end jewelry. Others were pawnbrokers who dealt in small, low-end jewelry. And this was pretty risky, actually, because a lot of that lower-end jewelry was stolen by maids who would steal from their own employers, and that is quite easy to track. So that was quite dangerous for the fence. One fence specialized in items stolen from warehouses, especially silk clothing. Some fences would specialize in taking stolen dresses to depots known as smothers, where they would be passed along to outlets for sale. Furs were passed on to crooked furriers who would remove labels and remodel the merchandise so that they would then sell the furs, but they would look different than they did in the department store, so that it was very hard to track who had originally created a fur coat. In East Market Street, stolen linens and utensils were sold to buyers who didn't ask questions about their provenance. Antiques were sold at the Caledonian Market. And an interesting criminal history side note about the Caledonian Market. It operated under a special medieval law called the Marché Ouvert, which meant that if an item was bought between sunset and sunrise, the buyer was guaranteed a title of ownership no matter what the item's provenance was. This market actually operated under this law into the 1990s.
Now, see, this is why I love British history. Just like the random laws that got passed in like 1200 that nobody thought to update. It's so great.
So yeah, there was this one market in London where you were just allowed to launder stolen goods because of this obscure medieval law.
God, what a history. What a country.
In addition to receiving stolen goods, some fences would actually commission thefts from the thieves they knew. So this was a very complicated back and forth relationship.
So, this sounds remarkably organized for what I had assumed was a somewhat disjointed criminal underworld given the constant threat of being raided by the police. But this sounds like a functional economy in a certain sense.
Yeah, this criminal underworld was a whole shadow economy, and there were millions of pounds worth of property moving through it. So, as you can see, being considered the queen of a territory like this, even if you don't have your fingers in every pie, just having sway in this world could be an incredibly lucrative proposition. It took a special kind of woman to become queen, and one woman stands out as the most famous queen of the 40 elephants, Alice Diamond. She was born in 1896 in the inhospitable Lambeth Workhouse Infirmary. Her mother was illegitimate, and her father, Thomas Diamond, had a criminal record for larceny and attacking a police constable. Alice grew up in what was at the time a squalid neighborhood. She grew up alongside many other girls who'd grow up to become members in the 40 Elephants gang. Her earliest known crime was actually the theft of chocolate from a store in 1812. She and her friend Mary Austin were cautioned at Bow Street Police Court. The next year, she got 6 weeks for stealing shirts. She was 16 years old at the time.
You got to work those summer jobs in high school to really start building a resume if you want to get ahead in life.
I know, I was just doing admin work. I could have been out there stealing shirts. By 1915, police were already describing her as the Queen of the 40 Thieves, and her first jail sentence that year was for stealing from warehouses. Her gang of girls were notorious shopbreakers. Some of the money from their ill-gotten gains went to living in a style they could never have achieved through the work options available to them. But a lot of their cash also went to supporting the men in their lives. So let me describe the 40 Thieves of this period for you. They were a well-dressed and commanding group of girls. Alice herself was unusually bold and tall and imposing. Newspapers of the period actually reported on them as Amazons. They dress stylishly and they like to imitate the behavior and the confidence of movie stars. At the time, remember, movies are going from this rare novelty to something that is something that anyone can see. So these are sort of the icons of the era that they're trying to imitate. And they're not just acting like these chic movie stars because it's fun, although it is extremely fun to act and dress like a movie star. They actually needed to be stylish and to project wealth and confidence because if you want to blend in with the clientele of something like a really expensive shop or a high-end department store, you do have to look the part. Even at department stores with relatively lax security, people are going to get a little suspicious if you look like you don't belong.
Right. Makes sense.
Fortunately for them, a popular accessory at the time was the hand muff. If you've ever seen those old pictures of women with their hands kind of tucked into this roll of fur,
That seems like it would be quite convenient for stealing large numbers of things.
yeah, it is an excellent place to hide stolen jewelry. And Alice's own jewels, the ones she didn't steal or the ones she stole and wore, although the 40 Thieves did have some rules about not wearing what you stole, those weren't just for show. Alice actually would use her rings as knuckle dusters in brawls.
Sweet.
Yeah, Alice got into a lot of brawls, and her friend especially got into a lot of brawls. They fought a lot. So, to combat the rampant shoplifting, stores began hiring private detectives. So they weren't obtrusively, shaking people down and following people around in the way that we as Americans are familiar with loss prevention doing today. But there were still detectives who would try to find thieves in stores. The most famous of those store detectives was called Annie Betts. She was actually called the Lady Sherlock Holmes in papers. She managed to capture a lot of shop assistants stealing from their own stores, but she only ever actually collared one of the 40 thieves.
Get wrecked.
But this increased security at department stores was still a problem with the 40 thieves, especially once police learned to look out for shoplifters. Some of them started heading outside the city to find easier hunting grounds.
Well, this sounds like it would be kind of generally a time of transition, not just in terms of better security, but English history is about to change quite a bit. So, how does World War I impact the business of this group?
Well, for a lot of the men in the orbit of the Elephant Gang, war either meant enlisting themselves or becoming deserters. But for the women, war was a rare opportunity because jobs that paid well were now available in munitions factories. So their options weren't just workhouses and crappy factories. They actually had the opportunity of really well-paying jobs. So a lot of them were not shoplifting during this period. The weird thing, though, is that Alice Diamond attempted to get a job in a factory with somebody else's ID, and it's unclear if she actually wanted to work there or if she was trying to steal explosives because she was connected with a lot of safe crackers. So there's clearly still some criminal activity happening in this period.
I mean, you got layers within layers in the planning. Maybe that job doesn't work out, but you take a little extra home from the office.
Yeah, have you ever stolen office supplies like C4?
Yeah, they don't leave it around in the teacher's lounge as much as they used to.
So eventually the war does end. A lot of those great munitions factories jobs come to an end, and shoplifting resumes at a frantic pace. Alice Diamond sees an opportunity for the 40 Elephants, and she starts strengthening the gang's connections both with the Elephant Gang, but also with other gangs in the area and with other large criminal families like the notorious Hill family, which had a truly spectacular number of criminals in it. The girls worked alongside men. They would do things like steal checks from the mail. They would help men from the other gangs collect information from burglaries by casing houses. And they brawled pretty freely with men and with other women. I think this is around the time that a couple of members of the 40 Thieves just kicked the absolute shit out of some young men who were infringing on their territory. They were enforcers in their own right. Alice directed the movements of her gang. The low-ranking members worked shops in less glamorous parts of London. They would be divided up into cells often, so she could send different cells different places. Alice and her second in command, who was Maggie Hughes, also known as Babyface Maggie because she was quite beautiful and quite young looking for her age. Those two women would take the best stores in the West End. Alice was the brawn of the operation, and Maggie was the beauty who would lure men into committing indiscretions. Even after the two women were sent to jail in 1920, Alice continued to command the thieves from her cell. The 40 Thieves followed what was a very strict set of rules called the Hoisters' Code. These were rules for things like being punctual to meetings, not drinking on the job, not wearing the clothes that you stole, providing alibis and money for defense lawyers for other members of the gang who'd been arrested, and there were even mandated bedtimes. You could not go to bed too late on the day before you planned to commit a crime. That's how strict this rule was.
I love that. All right. Make sure you get enough sleep. All right. It's important, very important to start your day off right.
Yeah, actually, when you see sort of what happened to a lot of criminals at this time, it actually makes a lot of sense that if you want to run a tight ship, you have to really be careful to make sure that your members are not, for instance, drinking heavily on the job, as quite a lot of people did. And the penalties for breaking these rules were pretty serious. Members who failed to follow the rules or who committed treachery against the gang might be shunned for certain periods of time, so you just can't work with the gang. But in more severe cases, they'd be driven out of the district or even beaten. Like, these women were capable of administering quite a beatdown. In spite of all these rules, the 40 Thieves did like to party. They danced and gambled in Soho, a fashionable and lightly scandalous district of London. The post-war nightclub scene was immensely appealing to these young women, both because, frankly, it sounds like a really fun time, and also it was a great place to nab fur coats and other fashionable items worn by rich partiers. In spite of her borrowed glitz, Alice Diamond had a tough time getting into the very best clubs. The Kit Kat Club, one of London's most elite party spots, denied her application, and apparently she threw a gigantic fit at the door when she was turned away.
Classist bastards. Someone makes an honest living stealing goods from other people and you don't respect it.
So the post-war housing boom also allowed many of the thieves to move out of the rundown homes they'd grown up in and take up living in stylish new apartments. The gang was careful about making sure that if any woman went to prison, her rent would be paid. So this wasn't just a group of people who stole together, this was a group of people who were each other's safety net. So while these women were working the nightclub scene, a lot of organized criminal organizations run by men were working the same scene in different ways. The Elephant Gang made a lot of money off the protection racket. Basically, if you are in a certain territory, you are coerced into paying money for protection. Big air quotes around protection, often protection from the people that you're paying. And this can be a really lucrative racket, which meant that a lot of gangs were fighting over it. So over the course of the 20s, the Elephant Gang brawled with a lot of other gangs of this territory. There were the Sabinis, there was a gang called the Camden Town Gang, the Bethnal Green Gang, the Yiddisher Gang, and the Brummagem Gang.
The Yiddisher Gang, eh?
Yeah, actually, interestingly, although Jews in London had their own criminal organizations, Several Cohens actually come up in the ranks of the 40 Thieves. So they were a somewhat mixed religion gang in a way that was not super usual at the time. So that's an interesting fact about them.
It's quite heartwarming, you know. We're all conjoined as humans by our desire to steal nice things from other people.
It truly is the human condition. So, while the male gangs were fighting over these club territories, the 40 Thieves were defending their own territory from gangs of rival shoplifters. And they, again, defending their territory did mean they absolutely beat down quite a lot of other women. These were pretty violent altercations. Alice and Maggie were frequently in and out of prison throughout the 1920s. Maggie grew increasingly wild. She slashed up her own husband, who she'd married at just 15 years old, with a razor after he objected to her affair with another man.
That's not usually how that story goes.
Yeah, she was very, very violent. She'd go after people with razors or with bottles quite a lot. She caused a huge number of injuries. I don't think she ever killed anyone, but she messed some people up very badly. Although, after attacking her husband, she felt bad for him, so she did buy him a car.
That makes up for it.
She had a very complicated relationship. In 1925, many members of the gang, including Alice and Maggie, were involved in a brawl after one of the 40 Thieves, whose name was Mary Britton, married an outsider. So again, members of the gang are allowed to associate with men, and they associate with some extremely crappy men, but they kept their own circle insular for their safety. So you could associate with some real scumbags, but they had to be the right scumbags.
Well, you know, it's important. Keep up the right sorts of people.
Oh, yes. And in the 1920s, the right sorts of people gain access to a new technology because this is the era of the automobile. And automobiles open up a really exciting new type of crime. These are smash and grab raids where the thieves would smash windows to get expensive goods, and then instead of kind of awkwardly riding off on a horse on a crowded street, you could just zoom off in your car. So this is the period of some truly wild car crimes. Lillian Sparks, who was also known as the bob-haired bandit because she had a very fetching 20s bob, was a notorious getaway driver. Maud Seymour and Mary Gibbs were also famous for using their cars for crime. So, one night in 1927, I think it was something like 14 cars, a huge number of women, and their male associates who they would use sort of to do some of the grabbing of goods while they played getaway driver. So these women meet up and they split off and they go to department stores all over town. So they're going to hit all of the department stores at the same time in order to keep the police distracted. And what they do is they actually crash their cars through the doors of the department stores. And then the men in the car or the other women who they brought along with them jump out of the car, grab a bunch of goods, jump back in the car, and they drive off. So they actually drive through the building.
The Terminator special right there.
One of the thieves actually kitted out her car and made a crime mobile. So she added extra large mirrors and a periscope so she could keep a watch on what was going on behind her while she was committing crimes.
I guess you can't street park that anymore is the one thing.
It's kind of a primitive backup cam, actually. I bet you could street park very well in that.
Well, no, I mean, it's a little conspicuous.
I think it was kind of a hidden periscope. It sounded really clever.
Okay, that's pretty good. That's pretty good.
So cars let the thieves hunt further afield. It was a lot easier to get into and out of London now. But it also meant that they had trouble moving stolen goods back to London without detection. And there were quite a few capers around this time of people moving goods by rail and by car and evading the police by having to sleep in seedy motels because these women were known for being so high class they wouldn't sleep in seedy motels, so they have to sort of slum it to drive their goods around. So this is the new hot new thieving technology. Unfortunately, in the 1930s, Alice and Maggie had a falling out and stopped working together. Maggie continued to violently lash out. She developed a serious drinking problem. You just can't have that kind of liability in your gang.
Yeah, that's a hard way to do business. So, okay, we're in the 30s now, so we're coming up on the sequel to World War One. What does World War Two do to the shoplifting scene in the world of the 40 Elephants?
So there was certainly a thriving criminal underworld during World War II, which is very interesting and deserves its own episode. But shoplifting on the scale that the 40 Thieves did it mostly ceased due to fear of bombs and of being sentenced as a looter, which was a much more serious criminal offense than normal non-wartime shoplifting. However, although large scale shoplifting kind of tapered off during this period, a lot of women did shoplift during this time, just doing sort of smaller scale, grabbing something they wanted. And they tended to get really light sentences for this. They were often pitied in court because they were stealing hard to get necessities like stockings. I believe you actually had a limit on how many silk stockings you were allowed to buy. And if you tore a stocking, good luck. You're stuck. Actually, something that is quite famous from this time period is that women used to use their eyeliner to draw the line that would look like the seam of a silk stocking on the back of their legs. Yeah, so it was this sort of weird, really wanting this normal thing and this normal garment of wanting the silk stockings and not being able to get them. So honest women would just fake it with that eyeliner, but sometimes dishonest women would just grab something. But this was seen as kind of a low priority crime. Also, a lot of shoplifters who did appear in court had their behavior blamed on wartime stress. And this was a really, really stressful time to be in London. A lot of the women of the 40 Thieves were in London through the worst of the Blitz. So some of them learned to take advantage of coupons, which is another brand new invention in shopping. They would steal these coupons and then sell them to bargain hunters for, less than their full value. So you're still stealing, but you're selling people something that looks legitimate that they can take right back to the shops.
Man, what a time where coupons aren't just something that clog up your mailbox.
Yeah, coupons actually had a time when they were invented and they were brand new. So after the war, Alice Diamond remained in the 40 Thieves, but she'd taken a step back from leadership and she started focusing on training up the new generation. And she has her eye on a young woman named Shirley Pitts. Shirley rises through the ranks. She officially becomes queen in 1960. And Shirley had a similar background to her predecessors. She was born to a criminal family. Her criminal career actually began when she was stealing milk and bread from other people's doorsteps. It used to be really common to have those things delivered daily because she needed to feed her family. Her own father was in and out of prison so much that he wasn't really providing for them reliably. Alice started training her up when Shirley was just 13 years old. And Shirley finds these women who are teaching her how to steal dazzling. They look like film stars and they teach her to dress and act like a respectable woman. But under her glamorous outfits, Shirley would have bloomers or long johns, and then she could sort of open up her skirt and then slip stolen items into those pants. So she once managed to steal 3 fur coats in one go, and then she had to waddle out of the store like a duck because her pants were so full. A floor walker who saw her leaving was afraid she was about to give birth, and her friends had to call her a cab and pretend that she, oh no, we have to get our friend away. Our friend who definitely does not have 3 coats in her pants.
This is why I wouldn't be a good thief, because it wouldn't occur to me to try and grab more than one fur coat and stuff it in my pants.
Yeah, being a successful shoplifter means that you have to be really brazen. It's robbery, but it's also kind of a con job because you do have to con everyone around you into believing that nothing is wrong. Shirley was a charming thief, but she made a lot of missteps. She was sent to a reform school after a shop assistant accidentally fell through a plate glass window during a fight, and that shop assistant got severe injuries. Although many of the 40 Elephants dated layabouts or outright criminals, Shirley had really bad luck with a string of abusive boyfriends. She was involved in serious crimes with her family, and she was caught red-handed housebreaking with her own father. So how is that for a father-daughter bonding activity?
That's beautiful, family coming together.
Yeah, one of her brothers was also especially notorious as a criminal. So, yeah, just the whole family got in on the action. As technology to detect shoplifting improved, Shirley had to resort to smaller and more careful hoists. The invention of the anti-shoplifting alarm during this time period was a big challenge, but Shirley overcame it by lining her bags and pockets with foil. Basically, she actually conducted a lot of tests where she would do things like cut the tags, the anti-shoplifting tags that set off those alarms, off items, and then she would sort of hang around near the entrance of the store to figure out how far away it could detect the tag, and then she would cover them in foil to see, will the foil stop the tag, will leather stop the tag. She was really systematic about figuring out how these alarms worked by sort of reverse engineering them. She learned that it was easier to lift large hauls from depots, so basically the place where these items were stored before they went to the store, instead of stealing things directly from the store. So less, in her later years, less stuffing fur coats down her pants, more cleverly engineering a way to act like she had just bought one fur coat, or just walking into the fur coat depot and taking some coats that way.
The maturity that comes with age and experience.
So, speaking of Shirley's age and experience, her story, or at least her version of her story, is quite well known because she dictated it to a biographer in the 1990s. That book is called Gone Shopping, The Story of Shirley Pitt's Queen of Thieves, and it was published after her death in the 90s. She's the final known queen of the 40 Thieves. Around this time, actually, for reasons we'll talk about in our conclusions, shoplifting got a lot less centralized. So maybe there is a successor to the 40 Thieves and the 40 Elephants and the Elephant Gang out there somewhere, but they'd probably be hard to track these days.
I hope someone's keeping the tradition alive. It's tragic to lose something like that.
It is a shame to let such a fine British tradition go to waste.
Well, so thank you for that history of the 40 Thieves. I have to say my first reaction, I realize I say a lot on this show, but it really is true in this case, is how the hell is this not a movie? Like, I mean, you've got the structure already of like Shirley being kind of like brought in by Alice Diamond, and Alice is reminiscing about the old. Like, I could write that script treatment.
Yeah, the 1920s scene in particular, I felt like would be a really great fit for an HBO drama or
Oh yeah,
something
you could
like
build like a
that.
whole HBO expanded universe around this bad boy.
Yeah, there has been a lot of interest lately in the 1920s on film, probably because we're in the 2020s and we're experiencing some similar social problems. So there's quite a lot of hey there. So uh, maybe in the future we will see a sympathetic portrayal of them on screen, which is really interesting because, as I say frequently on this show, we don't talk enough about female criminals, and we especially don't talk about female criminals in organized crime. And I like a gangster movie, but gangster movies tend to be very, very male. And when women show up in those movies, they're often treated as I guess the most famous example would be the wife in Goodfellas of a woman who just does not question what people are doing, does not want to know where the money comes from. That's not really true of a lot of criminal organizations. A lot of women are actively working alongside their partners and sometimes even supporting their partners through
I
crime.
mean, that's really what a good relationship's all about, right? Is the bond of mutual support. You know, it's beautiful. I
Yeah, it
mean,
is. It's the 21st century, and girl bosses can be bosses of crime families. So for the 40 elephants, this was a way to gain money and power in ways that they otherwise couldn't. I mean, a lot of them, their only legitimate occupations would be, like I said, workhouses, factories, working as maids, which was an extremely difficult job at the time. I know that a lot of that work has been sort of whitewashed these days through shows like Downton Abbey. That was brutal physical work. But these women found a way to make their own money, to exert control in a way that they otherwise couldn't have. There just was no mobility into the class they wanted to be in.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting to hear you talk about that because it makes me think of actually some of the readings I did in graduate school about women's history in Japan, and particularly a book called "The Problem of Women in Early Modern Japan." The problem being that the kind of historical record is so dominated by like men talking about women as opposed to women talking about themselves. Um, and I can't remember who wrote that book, but the thesis was essentially showing ways in which women found like opportunities to push back against that kind of prescribed social status, often in ways that were, in the cases she was talking about, not like overtly illegal, but certainly skirting the kind of meaning of the law by following the letter of the law. It kind of seems like this is a similar case, never a different context, but much more extreme.
Yeah, I think there's sometimes a temptation to portray history of women had no rights and no power until the suffragettes came along and asked nicely. And oh boy, was that not the trajectory of history.
Yeah, it turns out it's a little bit messier than that.
It's a little messy. And speaking of mess, I should talk a little bit about modern shoplifting, which is really interesting because modern organized shoplifting rings still exist, but technology has changed yet again, and that means that the way that shoplifters steal has changed a lot. There are a lot of new scams that did not exist when the 40 elephants were in operation, like return scams, gift card scams, Amazon refund scams. I won't go into too much detail about how these are done because I don't want to aid any criminal activity. But something that has really changed about the world of shoplifting is that you don't really need a fence in order to shoplift now because, as I said at the top of the show, eBay, Craigslist, Facebook Marketplace, OfferUp, all of these places, they do not check any kind of receipt about where you got the goods. They're not really checking for any kind of certificate of authenticity. It is very buyer beware on those sites. And that does mean that if you are a shoplifter, you can move quite a lot of merchandise on your own.
Uh, Technology just, it's changed so much, you know? It's tragic.
So, the really weird thing I learned about organized shoplifting is that groups of shoplifters who are not really hierarchical in the way that the 40 elephants were, an organization, but people who are still in communication with each other, forming friendships and rivalries, actually still exist online. And during a very weird period a few years ago, they were actually publicly visible on social media platforms. There was actually a subreddit for a while where shoplifters would trade tips. And on Tumblr, which was a famously poorly moderated social media site, there was an entire community who called themselves the lifting community, and they would trade tips on how to shoplift. I think that subreddit has been taken down, and most of the Tumblr activity has been taken down. But if you know where to look on Tumblr, you might actually still see some of those posts from shoplifters.
I do just, I have this image of this like super dude bro who really wants to talk about like his lifting routine, getting very confused trying to browse Tumblr.
That actually happened. This okay, so
Wait,
this totally
really?
yes, so this totally fascinates me. So part of the reason why Tumblr was such a mess in its heyday was that there was no separating people out into groups to socialize. You use these sort of community tags. The problem was the weightlifting community and the shoplifting community both wanted to use the lifting tag, and they would have sort of these online turf wars about who got to use the lifting tag. It was really fascinating.
Wow.
So yeah, shoplifting as it exists today is very different from what the 40 elephants were doing in some ways, because the way we shop has changed quite a bit, but it is absolutely still criminal activity that is happening today. And I don't encourage it, but also life finds a way.
The human spirit can't be kept down.
It is really interesting, actually. I spent maybe a little too much time trying to sort of chase the remnants of the lifting community around Tumblr because it fascinated me, and it intersected in a really weird way with a lot of that sort of internet leftist capitalism is bad. A lot of these young people, mostly young girls, were justifying their behavior by saying that they were fighting capitalism. And it was so fascinating to me that 100 years earlier, women were saying that they were fighting the patriarchy to do exactly the same thing. Some things never change.
That's beautiful. Well, if people want to reach out to us about our brilliant idea for pitching this into a multimedia HBO empire, where can they find us?
They can find us at criminalrecordspodcast.com.
Or facebook.com/criminal records podcast. We should think of something else to say here because we used to plug our Twitter, but that's not a thing anymore.
Not at all.
Eh.
Perhaps in the future I will have something else to plug.
In
Hint,
the
hint.
meantime, I have fun looking here on Tumblr trying to find stuff about crime, I guess.
And with that, don't wear what you steal. I should have also said I'm really fascinated by how fast fashion has changed shoplifting. Sorry, I could talk about shoplifting all day. It is a truly fascinating crime.
I hadn't, huh? Yeah, I guess there's a lot less like high value clothing items to steal in the age of fast fashion.
Yeah,
Just one
yeah.
more of its many crimes, depriving us of some really interesting criminal behavior.
I think retailers should be more interesting to steal from. Hot take.